Location, Chapter 7 of Underlord. In the Seishan Kingdom, at least, talent had many different meanings. Prince Kiro knew that his own talent was nothing extraordinary. If he hadn't been supported by the royal family, he would have only reached true gold in his 50s or 60s, and never Underlord. It simply took him too long to integrate new powers into his spirit. There were others on his path of the Steel Guardian that could cycle aura into Madra faster than he could, or with better efficiency. His own brother, Daji, had more talent in that area. Their tutors estimated that Daji was roughly 10% faster in converting aura to Madra, though Kiro's cycling was steadier and less prone to interruption. If Kiro had one advantage beside his family's resources, it was that he rated above average in almost every area. He comprehended techniques quickly, his spiritual sense was strong, he had good compatibility with his iron body and core cycling technique, and he excelled in his studies. All of that, plus his diligence, made him a great sacred artist compared to the average person. Mera exceeded him to such a degree that she left him in awe. Kiro stood on a tower of stone raised with ruler techniques, looking out over the Seishan Kingdom's entrance into the Nightwheel Valley. As first prince, his job was to see and be seen, to supervise the flood of his people who migrated into this new land. He effectively had nothing to do but watch. Surrounded by armored True Gold guards and a protective script, Kiro stood over the Seishan Kingdom's march and projected strength. While he pretended not to be intimidated by the looming Akura fortress or the spinning wheel of darkness in the sky, he found his eyes repeatedly drawn to true strength. Off to the side of the marching army, but still within sight of Kiro's Underlord eyes, Mera knelt by a family of golds. They were bowing to her, which left her flustered. She waved empty hands and protested visibly, the pink flowers in her hair bouncing as she bowed repeatedly. All the while, she maintained a healing technique on a child. The young girl had broken a leg somehow, and her jaw clenched as she struggled. Tears ran down her face, but she tried not to move much as Mera wove life into her. Healing was nothing new to Mera, and Kiro had seen her do it 1,000 times. The gold parents were impressed, but of course they were. They were receiving the personal attention of an underlady. Kiro could see the bigger picture. While Mera deflected the praise of the parents and healed a girl's broken leg, she was also scanning the forest. Her spiritual sense spread out, vast but still agile, in concert with a ruler technique that scanned the life aura in the area. Mera was getting a sense for everything around her, the identity of the local plants, their powers, the layout of the terrain, even the nature of sacred beasts and other enemies. All that at once, and using a technique that had been developed for gardening, but which she had bent to use in combat. Kiro hadn't known what the word genius meant before he met her. He knew he was nothing but an above-average sacred artist with the good fortune to have been born as a prince, but there had been a time when he'd been proud of his talents nonetheless. Many exceeded him in a single area, but few exceeded him as a whole. Even the memory of that pride embarrassed him when he compared himself to Mera. And yet, he was the one the people looked up to. "Stay here," Kiro ordered his guards. With no further explanation, he leaped off the tower. They shouted after him. Guards weren't supposed to take orders that involved abandoning their charge, but they were only true golds. They couldn't catch him. He landed next to a family in a wagon, and he extended a hand and a bit of soulfire-empowered aura control to steady the crackling horse remnants they had pulling their belongings. "Your Highness!" the man blurted. Kiro raised a hand in greeting, but if he stayed to talk at all, he would be held down by the mass of people. He dashed off, leaping over entire crowds. He reached Mera in less than 2 minutes. She sensed him coming, of course, and she withdrew her techniques to kneel as he arrived. The family was petrified, pushing their faces into the purple grass of the Nightwheel Valley. Even the young daughter followed suit, though her leg had been broken a moment before. As gently as he could, Kiro stopped the girl from lowering herself. "We wouldn't want to undo Lady Mera's hard work, would we?"
"She's fully restored, my prince," Mera responded immediately. "She is more than capable of bowing to you."
"I find myself honored enough. Rise, all of you, especially you, underlady." The golds followed his instructions, stammering out their thanks and their gratitude for Mera's attention. Mera seemed as though she'd forgotten they existed. She rose to her feet as he commanded, but her head stayed bowed and her hands folded in front of her. Kiro sighed inwardly, but he gave the family a warm smile. "My apologies for the troubles you suffered while working for our kingdom. Take this and be on your way, with my blessing." With little effort, he pulled out a high-grade earth scale and tossed it to them. He hadn't forged it himself, but it was almost as valuable as if he had. While shouting their thanks, they scurried away as though they didn't dare to delay their obedience even a second. There were thousands of Seishan citizens in sight, so of course he hadn't gone unnoticed. He turned back to the crowd and smiled broadly, waving for them to continue marching. No one had stopped yet. The flow of traffic alone kept momentum moving, for which he was grateful, so they had a moment together. "I'll remind you once again that you don't have to bow to me," he said to Mera. "Underlords can stand in the presence of the royal family."
If I have the option, I choose to bow, my prince.
She was only so stiff when there were outsiders around to witness, but even when they were alone, she still treated him like a scion of the heavens. Kiro had been chipping away at that attitude for years, but some days it felt like an impossible task. He sighed out loud this time, for her benefit. "I wish you wouldn't, at least sometimes."
"I have to set the example,"
Mera said seriously. But a smile cracked her face a second later.
"Besides, why stop now? You'll be an overlord soon, and then I'll just have to start bowing again."
That was a little better. At least she was willing to talk casually with him when they were alone. "You'll advance before I will, and by a good 5 years at least," Kiro said honestly. They hadn't discussed this before, mainly because, before the opening of the Nightwheel Valley, advancing to Overlord was a matter of the distant future. Mera's gray eyes were blank with confusion.
"Of course I won't. It would cost a great fortune to raise me to Overlord, and I would never accept them unless you had advanced first."
"Mera, you—" He'd never said the truth out loud before, and even considering doing so made him watch the skies for the approach of his father. Before his courage failed him, he went on. "You're more talented than I am. You know that. Don't let your respect for me blind you to your own skill." Finally, he'd said it. Now if only he could scrape up the courage to say as much to the king. Her gaze grew warm. Tentatively, she reached out to touch the plate of his armor.
"You see, my talents don't matter next to yours."
"Please don't mock me." He regretted the words as soon as he said them. Mera would be horrified at the very idea of mocking him, and he would have set their relationship back by years. Strangely, she didn't recoil in horror. She smiled wider and patted his armor.
"I may grow quickly. I may learn new techniques and defeat our enemies, but I'm only one person. You'll inspire 1,000 others like me."
Kiro remembered the first time he'd met her. The girl he'd seen carefully tending a sapling, weaving life aura so deftly that he'd sat up and stared. "There aren't 1,000 others like you," he said. For a second, she beamed. Then she knelt again, with her face turned to the ground. Before he could ask her what was wrong, he felt the answer. His father was approaching, and Kiro had abandoned his assigned post. In a panic, Kiro turned to dash off. He wanted to apologize for his haste, or even to invite Mera to come stand beside him. But what would his father say? In the end, Kiro left without another word to Mera. He would apologize later, but she surely wouldn't understand what he was sorry for. By the time King Dakata arrived, Kiro was back in position, waving to the people from behind his guards. Alone and ashamed.